thank you all for being here tonight. So the image that you see on the left side of your screen is the cover of my book, which came out on July 31st of last year. And it is a culmination of about 25 years of off and on research. And it is 208 pages long and divided into three sections. The first section is on the Underground Railroad in Missouri and Illinois. And then the second section is on burial sites of enslaved people. And the third section is on dwellings of enslaved people. And I actually really wanted to get this out as quickly as possible because this African American history is such a hot topic right now. And I wanted to be the first one to get my research out there. And so I was able to contact Reedy Press, which is a local publisher in St. Louis. And they said that it really needed peer review from a university press. But I did not want to do that because it takes forever, like years and years. So I just contacted publishers throughout the country, and History Press ended up getting back to me. It took me about a year to a year and a half to actually do the physical writing of the book. And I waited till that manuscript was finished and I sent it in to them. And then they turned it over in like 9 months, which was super fast. And they let me put over 50 pictures in it, which I was really wanting to have a lot of pictures. So that was great too. And so my inspiration for writing the book is this little church, which is in St. Louis County, Missouri. It's called Old De Pere Presbyterian Church, and it was built about 1833. And enslavers lived in this area, and they started the church. And they did set aside an area in its cemetery to bury their enslaved people. And that area is still there in the little cemetery. And in the 1980s, the parent church, Faith de Pere, put a big boulder with a inscribed plaque to commemorate the burial area. So it is marked now. In the early 1830s, the abolitionist and free press martyr Elijah Lovejoy, who ended up being murdered in Alton, Illinois for his abolitionist viewpoints and was a major impetus for the Civil War. It was actually certified as a minister here, and that's documented in the primary Presbyterian session minutes. So we know that's true. And so in the 1970s, they were rehabbing the little church, and I was a kid, so my dad would walk me up there because he wanted to talk to the conservation architects. And so they were lifting up the old original floorboards, and they found a hidden room under there with a trapdoor. So it had the loose brick walls and the rough limestone and dirt floor. And they actually put me down in that little room, which was maybe big enough to hold a few people sardined in there for a few hours till they moved them to the next place. And then they had also found a tunnel entrance. So they didn't go through the tunnel, but they found the tunnel entrance. So there was a German abolitionist congregation in this church in the mid 1830s. So that's probably when it was used on the Underground Railroad. This was a very divided area. There were enslavers, French remnants from the French colonial era, and abolitionist Germans. So it was the perfect storm for the Underground Railroad. And unfortunately, when they did the renovations, they tore out the hiding place and the tunnel entrance and put a new sub basement in with the HVAC system. So all of that's been gone for a long time now, but I was fortunate enough. I was probably the last person to be in that hiding place, actually. So reasons for writing the book. When we talk about the Underground Railroad specific sites, it was a covert network. So freedom seekers were moving along paths and waterways and tracks, fleeing bondage to the North, Canada, and also other places. And so there's very little primary written documentation, although there is some. We can rely on like newspaper articles from the time, narratives, court records, freedom suits, that kind of thing. But most of the specific sites rely on a long oral tradition going back to that time. So we have to remember that that's really the only way we can study this. There's no book on the Underground Railroad in Missouri. There is in Illinois, but not Missouri. And I wanted to document never before published sites, which I mean, I guess maybe well over 50% have never before been published. And finally, foster a better understanding of a history often forgotten. So I thought I would show you this structure, which is in Florissant, which is North St. Louis County. And it was built in 3 stages. So that 2-story main structure was built in the 1840s. And a family lived there. They were actually, some of them were abolitionists and some of them were Confederate, and different branches lived there at different times. So both actually lived in this house at different times. And then the little addition on the back is from the 1920s. And then embedded inside the 1840s structure is a 2-story log structure with gun ports that has been dated by scientists to 1790s. And so that log structure, I worked on this with my friend Jean Curl, who's a local historian. And so that log structure, we think, was one of the rudimentary wooden forts that the white settlers could run into in case of a First Nations attack. And there were a series of these forts in St. Charles County and then down in the Defiance, Missouri area around the Daniel Boone home in that area. So we think that's what this structure was. And we were able to trace this property back to James Mackay. And he was the commandant of St. Ferdinand, which became Florissant later on. And so this was in the Spanish colonial era, in the second half of the 18th century. And so I was able to get all of the copies of all of the primary correspondence that he had with the Spanish officials in New Orleans and the Spanish officials of the crown in Spain itself. So really, really important stuff, very fascinating. And Mackay actually did an expedition west. He didn't make it all the way to the Pacific, but he mapped it. And then Lewis and Clark on their famous expedition actually used his maps. So this house was up for sale and I had always wanted to go in it. So finally I had my chance. So the realtor said, just go wherever you want. So this is the basement that you see. And it was pitch black. So I was just using my phone light, to light up the area. So that wall, that stone wall in the back there, and I apologize, there was just junk piled everywhere, so I couldn't get a really good photo, but there's a projection out at the bottom of that wall, and that's a 20th century thing put there to cover the tunnel entrance. And there you can see a fireplace, a really old fireplace over on the left side, and that goes all the way up to the second floor. And so there's a mid-20th century article with the owners of the house, and they owned it most of the 20th century, are their kids. And so the article does document that this tunnel did exist, and they had gotten some high school kids to go through it, but it got too scary and they couldn't go all the way through, but it was quite a long tunnel. And so this is the fireplace on the main floor. So, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Typically, the fireplace, the chimney and the opening to the fireplace projects out from the exterior wall, and then the opening is flush with the, interior wall, but you can see this one projects 4 or so feet right into the living room, which is typical of a false fireplace, which was a hiding place in an Underground Railroad safe house. There's actually one in the David Nelson house in Quincy, Illinois, that you can still go in. And it looks just like this. Um, and then we were out in the yard. There's a normal old well with a bucket pulley system and a well house. And then about 100 yards away, we found this, which was covered with boards, but we took the boards off and you can see the really old brick. And then later it's been kind of concreted over and stuff. And instead of a well shaft in there, it's just a big underground lake, and the water comes all the way up to the almost to the top of that opening. And so then all along the east side of the house, there's these concrete pads, not concrete, stone, sorry, stone pads that holes have been carved into. And so what I think is that, the false fireplace was used to hide them, and then they entered that tunnel down in the basement, and it ran along the side of the house, and then water comes up all the way at the top of these holes too. And so these holes were air holes or used to put supplies down into. And the false well was maybe an emergency way to get into that tunnel. And it went back to the creek behind the house, which was pretty big. You could put a skiff on the creek and then you could get to the main river. So I photo documented this whole thing, and I'm almost 100% sure this was an Underground Railroad station. And then during COVID, it was completely leveled for a new housing development. But Jean and I were able to actually save the log building, and so it is in storage at with the Bridgeton government right now, and they're going to reconstruct it in a park. But unfortunately, all the Underground Railroad stuff is now gone. Um, this one is in Alton, Illinois. It's the Enos Apartments now, but it was originally the Nathaniel Hansen House, which was built in the early 1850s as an Underground Railroad station. So it has 18-inch thick walls, and it has a huge cupola on top. It's up on a hill, so they could look from the cupola and signal the river if it was clear or not. So this is considered a documented station because Nathaniel's memoirs are still preserved, and he talked about his Underground Railroad activism in those memoirs. So the room you're seeing here in the slide, actually the doorway is flush with the basement wall. And then this room is entirely outside the footprint of the house and extends under the backyard. And then now what is 3rd Street? So they could just put loose bricks over the doorway, or they could put a big piece of furniture in front of the doorway and no one would ever know the room's there because, like I said, it's outside the footprint of the house. And that's again typical with Underground Railroad hiding places. So this room is absolutely like it was when they were hidden there. Nothing has changed except they added a light bulb and some piping up on the ceiling. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. It has the rough limestone dirt floor and the limestone and brick walls and ceilings. And then later on, after the Civil War, it was used as a coal bin because you can actually see soot all over the walls is still in there. Then on the other side of the basement, which would be the front of the house, there's a tunnel, which is still there. I've been in it, that goes to the detached carriage house. So what was happening is they would bring these freedom seekers across the Mississippi River from Missouri down to the Alton riverfront. And then this house way up on the hill would signal from the cupola if it was clear or not. And if it was, then they'd put them in a false bottomed carriage and take them up to the carriage house. And then they could just go use the tunnel from the carriage house to the basement and then stay in this room till they could move on. And I wanted to show you this little cemetery in St. Charles County called Black Walnut Cemetery. So it was in disrepair and just falling apart. And then when I took these pictures, it was interim. So a community group who's done amazing work had put all the markers where they thought they should be and cleaned them up and everything. And then now, maybe like 8 years later or something, they have set them up where they all were originally and put all this beautiful signage up, and it's a wonderful little cemetery and it looks great. But it contains the grave of Burl Jefferson, an enslaved man and resident of Callaway County. And unfortunately, they couldn't find where he was buried, so his marker's just standing up against a tree. And he had a marker because he died. When he died, he was actually free. He had been enslaved, and so therefore he had a carved marker. But most of the time, if you were enslaved, you had an unmarked grave or just a rough, unmarked stone. And also Doris Keevan Frankie, who's a local author and historian, um, found an unmarked section of burials of enslaved people here in the cemetery, and they're just uninscribed field stones in a pattern in their own section, which is typical of how enslaved people would have been buried. Their enslavers were marked in the main cemetery. I wanted to talk about this for a few minutes. So, this is Brazeau Presbyterian Church in Perry County, Missouri. So it's about 15 miles west of the Mississippi River. And the church was built in 1852, and the cemetery dates back to 1832. But normally, tie rods are put between the ceiling of one floor and the floor of the other floor, and then just the decorative pins stick out on the outside of the wall, and then they literally hold the walls together. But here they have exposed tie rods, which I'd never seen before. It's kind of unique. And then you see where the wreaths are. That's the solid wood railing of the slave gallery. That's what they called them back then. So the enslaved people were forced to sit up in that second floor balcony. And then there's all these carvings on the solid wood railings and posts up in the balcony. And so some were actually done by enslaved people. And then after the 13th Amendment, maybe the children sat up there or whoever probably also made some carvings too. And there's the fancier fonts are probably the educated people. And then the rudimentary fonts are maybe the enslaved people made those. The local historian did say that these enslaved people could probably just do simple ABCs and lettering and things like that, their names maybe. And you see in this slide, it's September 1865, and that's the year of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So perhaps one of the enslaved people carved that to commemorate one of the most important times in African American history. And then this is a diagram carved into the railing. And I had the head curator of the Missouri Historical Society with me, and she pointed out this actually looks like a diagram of the church or even like a barn nearby. And then, like, under the floor, there's that square with an X. So, is this like Underground Railroad code? Is that denoting a hiding place under the floorboards? Somebody at Eugene Fieldhouse who had researched voodoo said that some of the geometric forms look like the Dambala Vive from the Vodun religion from Africa, and also just African symbology in general. So I'm researching that right now, but it's unique. It's one of a kind. I've never seen anything like this before anywhere. And This is the Ludwell Powell House in St. Charles, Missouri. He was the first mayor of St. Charles, and this house was built about 1840. He was an enslaver, and the original brick slave dwellings were behind this house. They've been demolished. And also, there was a tunnel from the house to this tiny little church, which is now called Madison Street Church. But I think that it wasn't used on the Underground Railroad. In 1847, it was made illegal in Missouri to teach African Americans. It was also really frowned upon for them to go to church. So I think the tunnel was probably used just to get them safely to church without them being harassed by other enslavers that lived there. And then the little gray building um, was an African Methodist Episcopal church built by enslaved people about 1855. It was renovated into a residence in 1947. And Absalom White, a former enslaved person, lived in the little brick house on the right, which is partially cut off of the slide. After being freed, he was lynched for preaching the gospel. And later, workers found his freedom papers hidden under the stairs of that little brick house. And he was lynched in 1854 by a mob for trying to preach. This is the Ulysses Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis County, also known as Whitehaven. So every owner of this property until 1865 was an enslaver, from William Lindsay Long, and then the Hunts, and then the Dents, Frederick Dent, and he was the father of Ulysses' wife, Julia. And so Dent enslaved quite a few people, and Ulysses Grant was given an enslaved person by Dent. So Ulysses Grant actually did have an enslaved person. And Grant freed him, I think it was in 1859. And according to Emma Dent Casey's memoir, there were 18 simple log cabins on the northern part of the property that served as dwellings for the enslaved. In 1871, while serving as president of the U.S., Grant asked Whitehaven's caretaker to tear down the slave dwellings. So they've all been gone since 1871. And I always like to name the enslaved people because in primary slave censuses and inventories, they are not often named. They're just described by age and gender. So the Dent slaves on that Whitehaven property were Old Bob, Jim, Charles, Sue, Ann, Hester, Jeff, Willis, Dan, Henrietta Jones, Mary Robinson, William Jones, Aunt Edie, Kitty, and Rose, among others. So this is the door on the back of the main Whitehaven house. And you can see it's just so simple and rudimentary, and the enslaved people would have been forced to use that door. This is a detached outbuilding, which was used by the enslaved at Whitehaven as a laundry and kitchen. So the female enslaved would have worked in this building, some of them including probably Mary Robinson, and they would have lived up in the attic of this building, which you see here. And then there was a winter kitchen in the basement of the main Whitehaven house where the enslaved worked. Also, in archaeological excavations, actually found fragments of slate. So they think the enslaved people were secretly teaching themselves to read and write with these slate pencils and chalkboards, so to speak. This is Dennis Hollow Cemetery, and cemetery is misspelled in Valmeyer, Illinois. And so Valmeyer got wiped out by the flood of 93, but this cemetery was way up on a hill. And so it was actually saved and didn't get damaged at all. It's also known as Black Cemetery or Old Valmeyer Cemetery. An African American man lived in the hollow just down the road at the base of the bluff, and a Black community developed there. So this was their cemetery. This is Ebenezer Hollow Church near Rockwood, Illinois. And so there was actually Underground Railroad activity in this area before 1850, and then an abolitionist group was formed about that year and headed by Ezekiel Barber. And he took them on to William Harry's home where they were hidden in the cellar. The first Presbyterian church in Rockwood and this Ebenezer Presbyterian Church near there were involved in Underground Railroad activities. And the main road, Route 3, crosses the Marys River near Rockwood. And freedom seekers followed that river, where it begins at the Mississippi just below Chester, an Underground Railroad hub, almost all the way to Chicago. The graves of descendants of James Clendenin are buried in this little cemetery. And he was an Underground Railroad conductor. He had arrived in Chester in 1837 and used a cave on his farm as a hiding place. Then across the river from Ebenezer Hollow was Allen's farm. It was referred to as Allen's Landing and worked by enslaved people. A trade network existed between the landing and the merchants of Rockwood. George, one of Allen's enslaved people, was allowed to take goods across the river, and he used this as a cover to transport freedom seekers to Rockwood. So this is the Wagner Estate in Independence, Missouri. That's an old historic photo, the black and white one. And then on the right is obviously a contemporary photo that I took. So the building in the old photo on the right was the slave dwelling. The main house was built in 1852 with bricks handmade by John Lewis's enslaved people. And the famous American painter George Gatto-Bingham lived in the main house during the Civil War and used that slave dwelling as a studio where he painted his controversial Order Number 11 painting. And of course, that was demolished long ago. The slave dwelling, the main house is still there. So I just want to end the talk by showing you a couple cemeteries. This is Buster Cemetery. These are in the old French areas, a little southwest of St. Louis. So this is in Valley's Mines, Missouri. It is an African-American cemetery. But I love this cemetery because it's a microcosm of all the different ways African Americans are buried. This is a really simple iron cross marker because they would not have been wealthy and they couldn't afford these really ornate iron crosses like the old French families could. And these crosses were common in French cemeteries in Missouri, but I've also seen them in German cemeteries and with German language panels on them. This is a homemade grave marker. They took just a chisel and a nail or something like that and just hand carved this in there because they couldn't afford to buy a marker. This is simply a field stone, completely unmarked. At first, I thought maybe it was a footstone or a plot marker, but the way they're laid out, they couldn't have been. So I believe this is an individual grave marker. And this is about a 4.5 foot tall cross, and there's cowrie shells embedded in there, and that's like a traditional way of marking African American graves. This is an amazing cemetery. If you're ever in the area, it's Old St. Joachim Cemetery in Old Mines, Missouri. And the earliest death date I found was 1835. And you can see just tons of these iron crosses everywhere, hundreds of them. These are a couple of New Orleans style above ground graves, and these would have been wealthy white people. There's a bunch of these like crosses where they just stuck these rocks on there. And I researched it, couldn't find anything on them. So I'm thinking it might just been a way that this particular family liked to mark their graves. And just a scenic view. And there's like some of these graves are really deteriorated. Like this one, if I wanted to, of course I would never do this, but I could have just taken that metal cover off and it would have just been totally exposed. Elizabeth Casey was born in 1861, and she is listed in the cemetery records as colored. And there are other African Americans buried in this cemetery. And this is St. Anne Cemetery in French Village, Missouri. Roving missionaries offered religious services to the local residents before St. Anne's Parish was established in 1828. The present church was built in 1871 and rebuilt after a 1919 fire. And again, this cemetery has just tons of these French iron crosses, but you notice how ornate these ones are because these were wealthy French families that could afford to put this type of marker there. And I just thought this was interesting. The Aubuchons were a really old, well-known French family, and so on. They have a bunch of markers here. And so they originally spelled their last name as two words, Aubuchon, and then later on it just merged into one word. I just thought that was kind of interesting. But George Washington Brooks and his wife Martha were formerly enslaved by Salim Grandjean, and they are buried here in this cemetery. A cabin used as quarters for the enslaved people of Grandjean has been moved from its original location on the farm of Ouillet to the yard of the general store at Valley's Mines. And it's still there. It's on the cover of my book. And his nephew, Grandjean, inherited the property and later converted the slave cabin into a granary. There were 5 total dwellings for the enslaved on the original farm site, 440 acres located at the far eastern end of Valley's Mines. The Brookses lived on the second floor of the main brick house. Grandjean was married to Emily Aubuchon of a well-known area family. And the last site I'm going to show you is the site of the Peter and Nancy Hudlin House in St. Louis City, and it is now a Domino's parking lot. But Peter Hudlin was a free Black, and with the help of his wife, Nancy, received freedom seekers hidden in crates on wagons at this house. They were taken down to the basement and then on to Alton, Illinois during the night. There is an 1857 deed for this home, so we know it was built before then. Hudlin used the Lovejoy line as the Underground Railroad escape route. He was a member of the Knights of Tabor Secret Society, which hoped to end slavery by force of arms. And a couple other Underground Railroad sites, the Mary Meacham Freedom Crossing and the Meacham's home, are close to this site. So I'm sure that they had a network going there on the Underground Railroad. So I just want to let you know that if you're interested in getting a copy of my book, you can get it on the Amazon or Barnes & Noble websites or at the arcadiapublishing.com website. So that is it. And I thank you so much for listening to my talk. I appreciate it.